Well, hello everyone, and welcome to our Chapter 5 basically video lecture. If this lecture is posted, then that means that I am dealing with our new grandchild, and I wasn't able to make the live lecture. So with that being said, we're going to go ahead and do this as a video lecture so you can still get the right amount of information. Now, keep in mind that there's still going to be two lectures. There's going to be one affiliated with the textbook, which is what we're going to jump into in just a moment. And then there is an additional lecture that I'd like you to watch, and it has to do with criminal evidence, more so the forensic side. What types of evidence that you're going to find at a scene, some certain things that you need to document. So it's really important that you understand what you're going to find and how you're going to mark it, identify it, process it, book it, etc. So let's go ahead and jump into our Chapter 5 lecture. And when we're done, we'll talk a little bit about the writing assignment for this week. So here we go. So let me go ahead and bring this up here. Okay, so we're going to be talking a lot about first officer on scene. And it's important because understand that a crime scene really, is anything but a controlled environment, right? A crime has occurred, and there is some, an expectation that arriving law enforcement officials will bring some semblance of order, etc., and control to the situation that's happening. But we know that things are going to be fluid, things are going to be moving, and your crime scene could actually look like the picture that we're showing you right here. And when you look at this, not only do you have to understand things on a investigative side, where what might be evidence, what do I have to secure, what do I have to process, how am I going to do this, but you also have to look at it in the form of how do I document it properly. And that could be, assisted by, photographs and video, etc. But you're still going to have to document it. It may even be a sketch that you might have to do. And we've already talked about sketches. So what we want to do in this chapter is recognize how to prioritize your actions as that first officer on the scene when responding to any type of major incident. And also be able to identify and understand some of the major tasks, specifically 3, although there are going to be several, that need to be completed when you arrive on scene. Okay. We want to, understand the first responder's role in the processing of a crime scene, understand the steps and techniques in the interview process, and apply that to the chapter. So how are we, what is the chapter all about? But remember, as I kind of said earlier, a crime scene is anything but a controlled environment. There's this expectation that when law enforcement gets on scene, they're going to bring some semblance of order and control to whatever situation is taking place. And a lot of times it's a little bit more difficult because there really is a lot of confusion and chaos and things like that. We know that victims, witnesses, and often suspects add to the confusion and chaos. So they present different challenges. And remember that many times these crime scenes are active and, again, flowing with a lot of different moving parts. So think about this. If we take a minute, think about a car chase, a vehicle pursuit. And you're going to have to, when that pursuit is all finished, you're going to have to go back and you're going to have to document that. And if it's a really long pursuit down several streets and there's crashes and different things that take place, these are things that are going to have to be documented. So it's not really as easy as it seems. Well, the same thing could happen at a major crime scene where there's a lot of moving parts. There might be 2, 3, 4, even 5 different scenes. So there's a lot of things for us to kind of consider, but at the end of the day, we still have to document it. Now, upon arriving at the crime scene, the responding officer must determine what should be done first to secure the scene, and make the scene safe for citizens and law enforcement officials. Um, and once these priorities are accomplished, then the note-taking process begins. So the first thing we have to remember is that we're going to have to secure that scene, right? And we're going to have to make the scene safe. And then, once some of those things are done, and some of these other priorities that we're going to talk about in a moment are finished, then the note-taking part can actually begin. And sometimes that takes a little bit of time to get things going, right? And, unless you have a photographic memory, you really don't have the ability to recall everything that's occurred at a crime. So, relying on your short-term recall might be a roadmap to failure. And studies have shown that the simple act of writing something down helps to kind of imprint that, those facts or things that occurred in your memory. And additionally, the longer the time span between the actual incident and the time that you document it, that process, the greater the chance of inaccuracies or what we call omissions, meaning leaving things out. Not that you meant to, but because time has passed, there's a good chance that you might kind of leave some of that information out. So the purpose of note-taking, which is, another reason why sometimes I'll have you do those news discussion boards, which is where I want you to kind of view, a news video and take some notes and then write that summary. But the purpose of note-taking is basically to refresh your memory as you prepare to write your actual crime report. So crime scene note-taking is then an essential element in preparing your case report, right? Writing a complete and accurate report requires methodical documenting, right? Organization or organizing, and the presentation of facts, in that particular case. So you should take notes that allow, anyone who reads them to understand them and what they mean, and especially you. So, handwriting is important as well. And, we know that taking good crime scene notes and then transforming this information into an accurate and complete case report is really the basis of every successful criminal prosecution. Because after you're done documenting everything, if somebody gets taken into custody and a case gets filed, you're going to have to document all of that. So it really does, accurate reporting really does start with the ability to note take. And it's important that we kind of remember that, if you will. So note-taking also provides the transition from securing the crime scene to writing the case report. And when time allows, allows you to sit down and let's say write the report. Reviewing your notes will keep you focused on all the facts and details of the incident at a later time. So again, it's really important that we understand the basis of note-taking. So what then would be, or what are, what is the value of the first responder at a crime scene? Well, first, your initial actions are critical to the successful resolution of the incident. You are you're going to be the best source of information regarding the incident, what you see when you basically arrive on scene, right? And you may be the, only person to see and feel, if you will, the crime scene in its original condition. And, if the case is transferred to other officers, detectives, or something like that, your initial case report is going to be that basis for further investigation and follow-up. So, you really are the person responsible for thoroughly documenting your observations and the facts of the case by creating that complete and thorough report. And also, keep in mind, collecting and preserving evidence and bringing some type of resolution to this particular incident or case. So they kind of go hand in hand. And thus the reason that I've incorporated a couple of other videos that I want you to watch actually come from my AJ108 criminal investigation course, talking about different types of forensic evidence. And again, I know the videos are long, there's a couple of them, but it's important that you understand the basis of what you're going to see, because at some point you're going to have to collect it, preserve it, identify it, document it, and then write your report. So one really does kind of lead into the other. So some additional things that are, important as it relates to the first officer, to a crime scene. Your testimony will be a critical part of the criminal prosecution of any suspects. And that's definitely important, right? And your report will be the foundation for your courtroom testimony, because you are going to be testifying about your report. So again, all of these things are very, very important. The worst thing that could happen is that you have a lot of inaccuracies in your report and you go to testify about it and it doesn't match up to what you recall, right? So that's why, again, accuracy is typically stressed in a lot of these aspects relating to note-taking, report writing, etc. Okay, so what now would be 3 major tasks to complete when responding to a crime scene? And there typically are more. There's a lot of things. There's a whole laundry list of things to be done when going to a crime scene. And you'll see some of the additional items in a couple of those videos relative to criminal investigation in this that are going to go along with this video. But we want to cover a couple of larger, kind of the big ones, if you will. So the tasks are prioritized in order of importance. The first would be to ensure that your crime scene is safe. Is there a threat of a dangerous situation? If there is, it needs to be dealt with, right? If you're responding to a domestic violence, let's say, and there's some type of aggression still happening, that has to be dealt with. So, we have to, even if it could be the scene of a robbery, and you arrive at the scene and, you see what appears to be, let's say the clerk laying on the floor next to the cash register, and you survey the scene and maybe you see somebody in there that could be a possible suspect. So there's just so many things you have to kind of think about, right? But you want to make sure that your scene is safe before you actually begin to do your note taking, do your sketching, do your photographs, do your writing, okay? Number 2 would be to render first aid. And the next priority, if you will, upon arriving at a crime scene is to render first aid. And, this may sometimes entail compromising the evidentiary value of a crime scene. There are times where your rendering of first aid is going to mess up some of your evidence at the scene. Okay, so this really is okay. If you need to walk through bloody footprints in order to render aid to an injured person, you're going to do that. And then you're going to have to document, why you did that and the rationale, etc. Because we know the preservation of life has the highest priority once the crime scene is rendered safe. And this doesn't mean that you're not scene conscious, right? You still need to pay attention to things. If there's another way to approach a victim other than walking through some important evidence, then you can go ahead and do that. You can select an alternate route or something, but we know that life is going to be prioritized, obviously, over the top of evidence. So we have to kind of keep that in mind. And as a first responder, you'll be trained in assessing a situation and calling, for medical attention if required, etc. And if you're not sure whether you need medical attention at a crime scene, then if you're not totally sure, you call for it anyway. So it's better to be safe than sorry on some of these things. And then the last of the big 3, if you will, so we have ensure that the scene is safe, so you can operate in a safe environment, right, and that everybody is safe, etc., including yourself. We have number 2, render first aid if it's required, or notify, request medical assistance if you're not sure. And then finally, number 3 would be to secure the scene. So now that that scene, is safe and any first aid activities have been attended to, it's now time for you to secure the scene. Okay. And there's a lot of things that go into securing the scene. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a couple of minutes. But just to kind of get a little bit ahead of it, you're going to want to mark off and secure the crime scene perimeter. You're going to want to remove any unauthorized individuals from inside of the crime scene. You want to be aware of any evidence contamination and preservation issues. So these are just a couple of things. But let's kind of summarize these now. Now that we've looked at the big 3. So remember, number 1 was ensure that the scene is safe. So again, if there is a threat or or dangerous situation there, it needs to be neutralized or dealt with or stopped, etc. The first priority is to always make the scene safe. And I gave you a couple of examples because you can't work in, if it's an unsafe environment where there could be a potential, let's say, armed suspect still there, you can't do anything, even attend to a victim until that first, until the scene is safe. Then we talked about number 2, which was rendering first aid. And again, this may sometimes entail compromising the evidentiary value of the crime scene. And it's okay for you to do that if you need to walk through some evidence in order to render aid. If that's what it is, then that's what you do. Because the preservation of life has the highest priority once the crime scene is safe. If there's a way to select an alternate route to get in to deal with that person, then you can go ahead and do that. And it typically is the same way when if you're a first responder and you're at a scene, let's just say, of a shooting, and fire personnel arrive on scene, it's always better to direct them into the crime scene, tell them the pathway to walk in if it's available, so that way they're not compromising some of your evidence as well. So you can get them a pathway in and out. So that typically happens. And then finally, again, now that the crime scene is safe and all the first aid's been done, we want to secure it. And it can be done in a couple of different ways. And you can see the photographs here of crime scene tape, but you may even see that if you've driven by certain locations where an incident has happened, there might be some tape up there. But mark off and secure the crime scene perimeter, frequently accomplished by using crime scene do not cross kind of tape, or police activity, etc. And as mentioned previously, each crime scene is a little bit unique. It really is difficult to know the exact boundaries, if you will, of a crime scene. So the rule of thumb in marking off a crime scene is to always make it larger, and you can always pull that crime scene in. But once it's in, if you make it too small, evidence that's outside of that crime scene, of course, now is compromised because it's been, in that unsecured area. So going from small to big is not good, but if you can go large, go way out there and then bring it in if you need to. So that's important when it comes to things like that. So it's better to mark off more area around where you think there might be some evidence, etc., than to do less. Removing individuals from the crime scene. And this includes, unauthorized persons, may include victims, suspects, witnesses, uninvolved bystanders, or even members of the media. So you want to make sure that those individuals are moved to a certain location and they're not just wandering around your crime scene. Okay. And I threw some pictures in here. You can see this is typical crime scene tape that we have. And again, it's talking more about how you can make the crime scene, you can always bring it in smaller. A lot of crime scenes, sometimes you'll see here, there'll be tape on the exterior perimeter, and then inside here, where there might be some things that aren't visually appealing to the public, they use these large kind of fabric dividers, if you will. These are like scene dividers, so it's kind of like a big curtain around everything. So you're not putting anything directly on top of the evidence, but you're just kind of limiting the view for spectators, etc. So again, remember removing these unauthorized individuals. Part of what you're going to have to remember too is to separate all your potential witnesses. And the reason that you do that is to ensure that they don't talk to each other, and that their stories are going to be independent of each other, so they're not all deciding as a group what happened. And when it comes to, bystanders, or especially the media, while the media does have certain rights, if you will, to be in certain locations at crime scenes, they're not allowed to trample through your evidence or interfere in your crime scenes. Therefore, a lot of organizations will designate a spot for the media to set up. So it's outside of the crime scene in a certain area. They have a PIO, or somebody that can talk to the media will be there to keep them updated, but you keep them in a separate location. But it is important to separate all witnesses. Be aware of evidence contamination and preservation when processing your crime scene. Again, if you must move an item inside the scene, make a note, as this will need to be noted in your report. So anything that you do, okay, you want to avoid moving or altering any potential item of evidence while processing the scene. But if you do have to move it, don't return it to its original location. Just note that in your field notes that the object was moved and processed at its current location. So let's say you had a crime scene similar to the picture here on the right, and maybe there's shell casings or something that could be damaged by water. So if it started raining all of a sudden and you didn't have time to maybe cover something up, you could photograph really quick and document it, and you may have to pick up a couple of items. It just kind of depends. But if you do move anything, you're not going to move it and put it back. You're going to document it, photograph it, etc. before it's moved, and then in your report you'll document why it was moved. So hopefully that kind of makes sense. Okay, and it's important that we understand this, and a lot of times it does happen. Arrival of additional personnel. A lot of times you're going to need additional resources. It could be a scene of an arson investigation, so a big fire, or it could be a shooting scene with multiple victims, etc. So you're going to need to ask for additional individuals to help. And this might include emergency personnel, such as medics, firefighters, could be forensic techs, or the crime lab, the coroner's office, or even additional police personnel, and of course detectives, depending upon your department policy. So don't be afraid to ask for additional personnel, and you're going to have to make some notes on who you assigned where. So if you assigned a certain officer to stand at the perimeter of the crime scene, then you would want to make a note that that's the person that you had assigned there, etc. So you do want to know where everybody is at. Okay. When you or other officers enter a crime scene, again, make a path that's the least intrusive. That's super important for us to kind of remember. You're in charge of that crime scene until you're properly relieved by either a supervisor or the detective unit, etc., or whoever the investigator is that's going to come out and take your place. So everybody at the crime scene should be basically what we call scene conscious, meaning that they understand the issues surrounding a crime scene, and that we want to make sure that we're letting people in the scene that need to be there, but we also want to make sure that they take the least intrusive way inside. I talked earlier about medical personnel. They're also, they have a need to get into the crime scene. So, and we know that sometimes they can create some crime scene issues. So guide them into the scene if possible, via one pathway and out the same way. So if there's a way they can go in and go out the same pathway, that's great. If not, then you'll have to make do with what you have. Okay, So again, as I kind of said, everyone at a crime scene needs to be scene conscious while accomplishing their duties. As the first responder, you are in charge of the scene until you are properly relieved by a detective, a supervisor, etc. And then when relieved, make sure that you notify communications, that would be dispatch, that the scene has been turned over to whoever that person is. So you want to let them know that, hey, Detective so-and-so is taking over the crime scene, etc. So that way they can make a note of it as well, so they know who is where at all times. All right, so what about processing the crime scene? And this is really where one of the reasons that I put in those two videos. I actually gave you the entire lecture for AJ108 criminal investigation, talking about evidence. And there's a real important reason for that, because I want you to understand the different types of evidence that are at these crime scenes, and some of the things that you really need to do to not just collect and process it, but to document it. So, understand that every crime scene is unique. If you're the first responder at a minor crime scene, you might be doing it yourself. So if it's a small scene, you're not going to turn it over to anybody else. You're just going to go ahead and do it. But if it's a major crime scene, you'll be part of a team of first responders, right? Each with their own task to complete. Again, on these large scenes, you're not going to be the only one. So you can look at some of the photos on some of these major crime scenes here. It's going to take a lot of people in order to process these crime scenes. So you don't have to do everything yourself. Okay. So it is important that you know that you have help. And those other individuals will document in a report, in a supplemental report. And we've talked about supplemental reports already. As a matter of fact, we have one this week where we're going to write a supplemental report on a follow-up investigation. And they'll attach it to the original report. Okay, so let's start off with, as part of processing the crime scene, what is an investigation? So let's try to define it, okay? And I think it's at least important that we know what it is. So an investigation, by definition, is the lawful search for things or people. And honestly, anything and everything should initially be considered to have some type of evidentiary value. But investigation comes from the Latin phrase vestigare, and it means to track and trace. So now that we know what the definition is, and it includes actually some things, right? I mean, so you're thinking, oh, an investigation, okay, but it includes discovering, collecting, preparing, identifying, and presenting evidence. And that's a lot of, and again, that's another reason for the other two videos to talk about, well, if we're going to write reports and we're going to document, how we discovered evidence, what we did to collect it, how we identified it, and how it was preserved or processed, etc., we have to know what some of those things are in order to to really properly kind of write about them. So, investigations include a lot more. Investigations also include deductive reasoning, which is, kind of a logical process. A conclusion follows from specific facts. So, consider, as the first responder, as you process a crime scene, that anything and everything should be considered to have evidentiary value. Your goal at any crime scene is to find the truth, and typically you only have one opportunity to process this crime scene, because once it's all done and the scene is released, then of course it's going to be open, right? The tape is down, the barricades are down, the dividers are down, and people are going to walk through there or drive through there, etc. So your scene now is going to be compromised, so you can't really go back as it relates to evidence. So a lot of times you only have one shot to process the crime scene. Okay, it'd be different if it was a car and you took that car to the evidence yard at your police department, then you could go back and reprocess the vehicle. But when it comes to the actual scene itself, you may only get one shot. So you want to ensure that every action that you take will be sustainable in a court of law, right? So it is important that we kind of, understand that whatever we do is going to impact whatever I'm going to write in the report, and it's going to be scrutinized when we end up going to court. Did I collect the evidence properly? Did I mark it properly? Did I document it properly? So as you're doing some of this, it's always a good idea to kind of think court. How am I going to write this? How am I going to defend this in court? Am I processing this the right way? Okay. You're going to want to maintain a chain of custody for each piece of evidence, and that's discussed in the criminal investigation videos. But chain of custody basically documents the fact of who found an item of evidence or potential evidence and who booked that evidence into the evidence locker and who examined that evidence. So there's a chain there, right? You're going to want to ensure that all potential evidence is preserved properly. Make sure you have, proper legal standing to process your crime scene. You may need to, obtain consent, or you may need to obtain a search warrant. So, especially if the crime scene is in what we call kind of a private person area, like somebody's home or a business or something like that. So these are all things for us to kind of consider. And remember that time is on your side here once you have secured the crime scene. So you don't have to hurry. You can take your time, and you can go through the entire crime scene without having to worry about rushing. The crime scene itself, consider, is often kind of an elusive concept as well. It's often impossible to know the exact boundaries of a crime scene, like I talked before. The initial crime scene typically is best described as the point where the subject turned his criminal intent into actions, and the crime scene should continue to into various escape routes. So the crime scene can be really big, right? And there could be secondary crime scenes, and we'll talk a little bit about that as well. But just remember, though, that time is on your side once you've secured this crime scene. And as we kind of talked about before, right? You basically only have one shot at processing the scene, because once it's released to the public, any further evidence discovered at the scene is going to be compromised and then really hard for you to justify in court. So the best procedure is to take all the time you need to process the crime scene thoroughly. And initially, again, anything and everything should be considered, as potential evidence. So in processing the crime scene, your goal, again, is to be, methodical and thorough, following, an approved crime scene processing system, or by your department policy, etc., or what you've been trained in, and using some flexible guidelines and, also common sense. A lot of real good investigators use a simple kind of methodical process, one that's not rigid, that follows, a logical set of principles to complete a thorough crime scene search. And most of these principles, again, will be included in your agency's, general orders or standard operating procedures. And as every crime scene will be unique, approved crime scene processing techniques, which are flexible enough to be applied to any crime scene scenario, are typically the best approach. So again, be methodical and systematic in processing the scene. Always keep an objective mind in processing the scene, because you're the fact finder and your role is to go where the facts and the evidence takes you. Now let's talk a little bit about the crime scene survey. So the survey, and we're talking about survey, not like a written survey. We're talking about how you would basically view, okay, or survey, if that's a better enunciative on the word, a crime scene. So your survey often consists of an initial walkthrough of the crime scene by the first responder and the lead investigators. And after that, prior to the walkthrough, you're going to want to assess the need for additional personnel, and if you need more, you can go ahead and do that. You can get more people. Definitely an important part of what you need to do. Upon starting your crime scene survey, note any temporary evidence. But as you go through the scene, you're going to want to identify, mark, and photograph evidence, and the temporary evidence first. And then you're going to want to communicate and document any evidence that you must move or alter, along with the reasons why. Remember, we talked about the fact that there may have to be some things moved. Let's say there's some important papers on the ground or something, but it's really windy and the papers are going to blow away. You may have to photograph those quickly and collect those as evidence, but you're going to have to document why you did that. So you don't just wait until the wind stops blowing and then put the paperwork back down, okay? So as I said before, don't recreate the crime scene with the piece of evidence that you've moved. Just be sure that you note the original, that location in your case report. And as we've learned, record all initial observations of who, what, when, where, and how as you proceed through your crime scene, okay? So, and I kind of talked about this a little bit just a minute ago about, recreating the crime scene. Evidence collection should not occur until all photos and sketches have been completed. So note that before you start actually collecting evidence, you want to do your pictures first, right? That makes sense because the photos are how you're going to capture the scene in its real state, okay? So, again, evidence collection should not occur until all photos and sketches have been, basically completed. Always photograph every piece of evidence before it is placed in an evidence container. And your criminal investigation videos will talk a little bit more about the evidence. Here we're just kind of covering some of the basics, if you will. You may also have to do a sketch before you end up removing evidence, right? That would only make sense as well. What you don't want to have is a sketch and a photo that have different things in them. Most agencies today will also use a video recorder when processing crime scenes. And I asked the question pros and cons on a video recorder, but understand, video is really good because as you're walking through a crime scene, you can narrate what you're seeing. You can also zoom in on what you're seeing. You can't quite get the same definition a lot of times as you might be able to get in a sketch or a photograph. But also understand that with a video recorder, it has sound, so you have to be very careful on what you're saying and any background noise or talking, etc. Sketching, as I mentioned a moment ago, it's another task that might be required at a crime scene, especially at a major scene. Each item of evidentiary value must be measured from different fixed points for inclusion in your sketch. Be sure to note all the points of entry and exit. And you don't have to be an artist. We've already talked about that, but you do know how to take some measurements. Your note-taking, steno pad or some, block-type graph paper can be used or useful in helping you create your crime scene sketch. A lot of agencies today have the first responding officers or a crime lab tech or a crime scene technician take those measurements and then put that data into a computerized program that produces kind of a CAD drawing, if you will, sketch of an actual crime scene. And I think I have a couple of those examples either later on in this lecture or actually in one of the other videos. Okay, so when we talk about evidence collection and preservation, be cognizant of what might be considered as evidence. Be objective and open-minded while progressing through the crime scene. Always document the collection of any piece of evidence. Ideally, this would be in the narrative case report with some photographs that are attached. But you'll also have some guidelines from your agency on how you're supposed to book evidence, etc. So those are always important things to follow your agency guidelines. And I have a page from the department that I worked at. You can see it's the Rialto Police Department. It's a page from their policy manual that talks about crime and disaster scene integrity. And there's more than one page of this, but I kind of wanted to show you that there are policies out there that talk about what you're supposed to do. And you can see it talks about the protection and integrity of a crime scene is utmost importance. First officer to the scene is generally responsible for taking efforts to preserve the scene. Remember, we kind of already talked about that. Officers shall consider safety and public safety, including efforts to render medical aid. So remember, we talked about that too. Remember the big three: safe scene, medical aid, secure scene. And then it talks about here, it kind of goes into considerations for the first responder. Ensuring that there's no suspects in the area, broadcasting information, first aid, evacuating if necessary, secure the inner and outer perimeters. We talked about that. Protecting items of evidentiary value. So you can see that there are, and it even talks about searches, etc. So there are policies that help you, on exactly what you're supposed to do. So again, be cognizant of what might be considered as evidence. Always document the collection of any piece of evidence. Should be in your case report, but again, there's a lot of times there's policy that goes along with it. As far as interviewing victims, witnesses, and suspects, taking statements is usually the responsibility of the first police, responder on the scene after we've finished with those big three, okay? That officer must immediately begin to restore order, control over individuals that are present at the crime scene. So if you have a group of individuals that are witnesses, you may have to separate them, and you may not be the one interviewing them. It could be somebody else. But you want to make sure that everybody gets interviewed. And a lot of times on really large, major incidents, witnesses are transported to the station where they can be interviewed in a more controlled environment, etc. Always be cognizant of officer safety. And once you've pulled out your notepad and your pen, your safety is kind of compromised because you're talking to individuals and you're not really paying that much attention to things that are happening around you. So keep in mind when taking notes, always place yourself and your mind in that defensive kind of position. Don't sit down. If the person that you're talking to is standing, it just keeps yourself at an equal level with everybody else, okay? So you don't want to compromise your safety at all. Always try to obtain photo ID for any person that you interview. You may just ask their name and they'll give you their name, but the next question that should come out of your mouth would be, could I see some type of identification? And if they don't have ID, make sure you get at least a decent description, their full name, date of birth, etc., before that person leaves the area. So that way you have a better chance of recontacting them, okay? You also want to acquire the person's phone number, name, address, phone number at their place of employment. All of these are necessary in case you need to recontact them or re-interview them, etc. When you meet these individuals or you make contact, make sure you introduce yourself. Ask open-ended questions first. If you need to, ask them to repeat what they've said or repeat their story just to make sure that you're getting it right, that you're understanding what they're saying, and ensure that the information is accurate. The most commonly used approach by good interviewers is to simply state something like, hey, tell me what happened. And most officers let the individual tell the entire story. And then once they're done, they'll kind of come back around with some follow-up questions to maybe fill in the gaps. But most officers simply listen to the story the first time, and then they kind of break out their notepad or whatever they're writing on, and then they ask the person to not just repeat the story, but maybe repeat certain parts, okay, to fill in those blanks. And remember, it's a good practice to ask the person to repeat that story or that statement a second time, which will help you clarify any information that might be in that gray area or vague, or that you're really not sure if you got it correct. Okay. Again, the individual simply tells the story of what happened. Take a look at people's body language. It's always, good to look at someone's body language. On page 55 in your textbook, it talks about some steps in the interview process. So these are really good informative steps that are really basic that you can use. So the first step could be to let the person tell the story of what happened, and then ask open-ended questions, which would be, tell me what happened, etc. Remember to look at their body language. The individual then tells the story again, and then you kind of take notes, right? You check for consistency, and you're going to ask some of those follow-up questions for clarification. And then what you can do is you can read back some of the notes, to that person. And this is where you have the opportunity to catch any errors or perhaps discover that, something was left out. So those are important things to remember. Just don't be afraid to ask people how to spell their name, how to spell the street name. If you didn't quite catch their date of birth, don't guess. Ask them for their date of birth again a second time, because accuracy is super important. And if you follow these basic guidelines, things are going to be a little bit easier for you. So here's some tips, okay? Well, before we get to that, let's just kind of summarize what we've talked about over this last, 45 minutes or so. So, addressing the writing style of this particular chapter, which is dedicated to the first officer on scene, we know is, it can be difficult, right? The main issue is the application of situational knowledge, right? Which is critical to a comprehensive understanding of how and what to document. So, attending to officer safety and scene control overlap into the arena of report writing. Your observations upon arrival at a crime scene are critical. It's a critical ingredient to your narrative report. So applying what you observed into a clear and concise narrative is essential to any resolution of any case. And what occurs upon the arrival of that first officer at a crime scene does help build the elements of a solid written report that's going to capture those critical elements that you need, right, to document that incident that you're going to be writing about. The responding officer, we know, is charged with identifying and later documenting key distinctions regarding the validity and significance of all aspects of the crime scene. And we also know that multitasking and your observational skills are paramount at this stage in the investigation, because your goal as the first officer on scene is to process the scene effectively while still documenting the events in a logical order that will later be translated, hopefully, into an effective narrative report. So you should be cognizant or understand that there really is a strong relationship between being that first officer on scene, your observations, note taking, interviewing, and the finished report, because all of these concepts that I'm talking about, including what types of forensic evidence, etc., that you might run into, all these things are intertwined. So I hope that kind of makes sense. So some tips for the first officer on the scene as we kind of wrap things up would be to, of course, ensure that the scene is safe, render first aid, secure the crime scene, which is different, right? Securing the crime scene is, so people can't come in, go out, etc. Arrest the offender if he or she is on scene, separate and identify witnesses, identify emergency respondents on the scene, and of course, you're going to end up taking some notes. Okay, so that's going to wrap up our lecture, but I wanted to take just a couple of minutes, and this is also available if you go back to last week's lecture. So it would be the Chapter 4 lecture. I talked a little bit about this upcoming week's writing assignment. So I wanted to show you a couple of examples of the writing assignment again. And if we go to our course canvas, this is what we're looking at. So you can see that this is our Chapter 5 writing assignment. And remember, this is just some information that you can use if you can't think of names or dates of birth, etc. Here's the scenario video. This is the basis for your report. Okay, and you might have to make up a couple of things, but this is the basis of it. And I give you the role, so there's 2 detectives and a suspect/employee. So the premise of this report, it's a supplemental report, just like you did the previous week. Make sure you use the headings. Okay, a couple of you still didn't use the headings, but make sure you don't have to use the template with the numbers. If the numbers messes you up, you can just use a Word doc. That's fine, but you still want to use the headings. So here we have a detective that telephones a suspect and basically interrogates her regarding allegations that she took money from her employer. And in the video, although the suspect initially denies the allegations, she subsequently confesses after the detective tells her that there's hidden video cameras recording her taking the money. And after the call, the detective kind of tells his partner that the video cameras really didn't exist, and he just said that to trick the woman. And we did have a little bit of conversation on the legality of using some trickery, if you will. And law enforcement, they can't manufacture evidence, plant evidence, if you will, but they are allowed to walk a fine line when it comes to untruths. Of course, they would have to document that in their report that they use some type of trickery, which is completely fine, but you can, under certain circumstances, use some trickery. Now, I also included 3 different sections. So I'm going to help you out and let you know that the actual section violated by this person right here is going to be Penal Code 503. And you can click here and you can go to it. This is for burglary. This is for grand theft. And this is for a section what we call embezzlement. So I'd like you to take a moment just before you write it, understand the elements of embezzlement. So as you're writing your report, you need to know what constitutes an embezzlement, okay? So as I put in the note here, use the headings, okay? And I'm going to show you an example report from a different student where you can kind of get some ideas. You don't need the face pages, the ones with the boxes, right? You can if you want to, but there really is no reason on this. It's going to be a supplemental report. So if you choose to just do the supplemental, the narrative report without the face pages, which is totally fine, make sure that you reference that supplemental report to the original report, just like you did last week, right? Because all of those supplemental reports are going to get attached. At the bottom of your assignment here, This is just for us to talk about. You don't need to include this in your report. But these are discussion points for next week when we come back and we do our lecture. Can the police use a ruse or trick a suspect into a confession? Should the suspect have been read their Miranda rights before the detective questioned her? And if video cameras were installed in the business, can they be used by the police without informing those that work there? Couple of interesting questions that we'll talk about next week. Okay, but I wanted to at least throw those in there so you guys could think about that. All right, now if we take a look at a report, and I'm going to see if I can find it. All right, here we go. So I'm going to scoot my little, okay. So again, the headings can be changed a little bit, but I want you to use headings. The student here decided to start with, and again, these numbers aren't for you to number the headings. They're just numbers for the lines for reference. If you don't want to use the numbers, you don't have to use, you can use the template that just has this part at the top. You can just use a plain Word doc, or you can use this template. So the student starts out with supplemental report to case number, and she makes up a number. This should be the same number on your supplemental. So the case number for the original report should be the same number as used by your supplemental. So she puts C incident report, etc. And then she also has the audio recording. And that could have been put under evidence or something else. But now it could be notification here as your first heading, or it could be details. Whichever way you want to do it is okay. But here she talks about, on this date at this time, the owner of the yogurt store here called to report theft of money from his cash register. The theft occurred this many times over this long of a time period, and that the total amount taken was approximately $400, and this is just what the student's putting, and the theft only occurs when this certain worker is working. Okay. The investigation: on this date at this time, this detectives recorded a phone call regarding a possible embezzlement suspect and put the lady's name, the suspect's name. And here the author of this report lists the suspect's information. You can do that, or you don't have to. You could just do this. So as long as you have this, that's fine. But if you want to add that, that's okay. And part of the investigation: I advised Smith that I was investigating theft of money from the yogurt store, etc. This is what the detective told her, and that she initially denied, but then later admitted and said she would pay back the money, etc. She didn't know how much she took, and then said that she would ask her mom for the money to pay back her employer. The student here adds a section called explanation of crime. You don't have to put that there, because we already know that, hopefully you read the elements of embezzlement. And so here, you don't even have to put this in here. She put this in here talking about the reason that it turned out to be an embezzlement. If you want to add that in there, you can, but you don't have to. And then recommendation. Now, remember, the recommendation is, or the conclusion is, what happened? Did I just take a report? Did I drive out and arrest the person, or etc.? Here the student says, Smith should be charged with an embezzlement, PC 503. It could just be, attach the supplemental report to the original crime report, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, whatever the crime report number is. And then I would actually, if you recorded the call and you're going to book the audio tape, I would add an evidence section in there for that particular part. Does that kind of make sense? Now, so I don't confuse you, understand, and you're probably asking yourselves, and based on the question that I asked earlier, if I pop back to this page here, remember, these are just discussion points for us to think about. Should the suspect have been read Miranda? Remember, Miranda requires two things, okay? Custody and interrogation. If one of those is missing, You don't have to Mirandize someone. So I want you to think about that when you're thinking, well, he really should have Mirandized her. Well, he could have if he wanted to, but was that person in custody? The answer is going to be no. So there is no custody. There was an interrogation, so one part's missing. So technically, he didn't have to do that, but I just wanted to kind of throw that out there for discussion purposes, etc. Okay, so hopefully that kind of makes sense to everybody. Same thing as before as far as the supplemental report goes. Don't forget to take the time to view the 2 videos from the AJ108 class criminal investigation regarding evidence, forensic evidence. I know that both of those videos are a little bit long, but it really, I think, will help enlighten you on what types of evidence that you're going to run into, because at the end of the day, when you find this stuff at the crime scene, you're going to have to document it. And it also goes over things like chain of custody and how things are booked. Everything kind of relates back to report writing, etc. So with that being said, that's going to conclude our lecture for tonight. And I'll send out some more information letting you know how the grandchild is doing. So that'll do it for tonight.